fault?
The FAA's job is enforcement.
Okay. Yours is safety. That's what I like to hear. Pete, we talked about your flying background before you came in today, and I was just fascinated on how you got where you are at your age as a pilot and an attorney. You want to talk about your aviation background and what forced you or made you decide to change careers in midlife?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I started out as a boy pilot. Actually, all of us 19-year-olds flew in Vietnam. I flew the Chinook flying Greyhound bus with twin rotor blades. After the military and a flight instructor job in the Army, I went to college down in Florida and got an aeronautical science degree and went into the Air Force with a direct focus on a professional airline pilot career. While I was in the Air Force, I got into a car accident and fractured my skull, and that resulted in my medical being taken away, as well as my...
Oh, so you've had some problems with the FAA in your lifetime too, huh?
Yes, my jet flying career was over for the military. I went and I flew helicopters in Iran, and while I was there, I decided that I was going to educate myself and go either into medicine or law, and I chose law. I went to the University of Denver, and for the last 10 years I've been working as an aviation lawyer and continue to be a professional pilot. I have 6,000 hours and ATP.
You had mentioned that you were on a flying job this summer.
Yes. Occasionally I work with clients, both, for example, this summer I was developing their drug testing program and at the same time helping them out on the oil spill in Alaska as a helicopter pilot.
So it sounds like a nice diversion from someone who works in front of a desk all day like myself. Is you out and fly for a living sometimes?
Yes, and I spend a good majority of my time in front of the courts.
So to get started, Pete, I'd like to ask you if you can tell me about enforcement and compliance in the FAA's new enforcement policies against pilots who fail to disclose alcohol and drug convictions on their medicals.
Yes, let's take the overall enforcement and compliance program. It's far more aggressive now. The FAA has taken the view, at least the FAA attorneys, that they are the policemen of the skies and that they are attempting to get more enforcements, more tickets, if you will. That has resulted in a lot of friction between the aviation community and the FAA. We're no longer looking at FAA as an educational organization, as someone that we can seek information from. We look at them as our adversaries, and I think in the enforcement program you have to, as we go through this program, you'll see that you have to look at them as adversaries and treat them as adversaries early on so that you don't fall into their trap, because once you're into the trap, you assist them in proving their case against you.
And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. On to the medicals and all the cross-checking the FAA has been doing the last couple of years between driving records, FBI criminal records, and some of the questions on the medicals. Anything you'd like to talk about? I know a lot of pilots are concerned. I don't think everybody knew that there was a grace period for a long time. It seems like the air carrier pilots are always up on all this stuff, the guys who make a living, and they know all the wiggles on how to use grace periods and get between the lines throughout their career, but the general aviation pilots don't. What about medicals? So what kind of trouble are guys getting into?
The air carrier pilots usually have the unions that have legal representatives that give them the information. The general aviation pilots don't have that. What the FAA has done is they took a steer in the direction of medicals, because there are questions on there that can basically lead a pilot to give them information, especially if it's false information, and they ultimately try to find a criminal violation.
Which questions are those?
Let me take a look.
Okay.
The medical certificate form that you fill out for your doctor has questions all about your physical condition. At the very end, these are all yes-no questions, about 30 of them. It says item V, record of traffic convictions, item W, record of other convictions, and asks and remarks if you say yes to fill that in. Pilots for many, many years for traffic convictions, particularly routine ones like speeding and that sort of thing, were putting no because it really has nothing to do with the medical conditions. And courts have so found. However, the FAA finds that by looking in the state traffic records for pilots, that if they do have traffic convictions and they put no on their forms, that Down in the bottom, that's called perjury, and they are attempting to obtain criminal convictions
Are
for
you just talking
perjury.
about one traffic violation, like a U-turn or copping a plea for an obstructed windshield, that something that small has to be put on that form?
Yes, any traffic conviction. Now, it doesn't, a plea of no contest is not a conviction, but if you're convicted, i.e. found guilty, that should be on here. Record
Or
of,
if you just sign the envelope and put a check in and it just says, I plead guilty, and you check all those boxes that you're waiving all your rights, any violation needs to be on that form.
That's right. And then it says record of other convictions. They're overall looking for drug convictions, at least in today's society. But if you have any conviction, it should be yes on there. Pilots are in the problem now where they've been getting medicals for 10 years, putting no on there, and when they put yes, and the conviction was 8 or 10 years ago, now FAA is looking at them and saying, in your past, you have lied, committed perjury.
You mentioned drugs. I'm aware that last year the FAA attempted to prosecute some pilots in Florida based on the information they used on medical history, what you were just discussing. Can you tell me about that? Are you aware of what happened down there?
You bet. And the courts in Florida found that the questions on the medical forms were to obtain medical history. They weren't intended to obtain history of convictions, and that at least the court found that this was a trick question, and they were not going to, in fact, the court refused to accept a guilty plea from a pilot who just wanted to get it over with, refused to accept that plea because they found that this question was not intended to lead a pilot into that trap, and the court called it a trap.
And you had mentioned something to me earlier as we were discussing what we were going to cover here, that it was right at the end, after you put all these no's, no for heart trouble, no for nervousness, no for all these medical problems, right at the end, it's like you said, a trick question. They have these things and you're just putting all these no's down. And did that influence the court's decision in Florida?
It did. They noted that it was way out at the end of the list, included after other illnesses, which you can note convictions aren't
Now,
illnesses.
after I read that had taken place in Florida, I heard that the FAA says, well, we don't care what that judge says. We're going to go nationwide and merge all the records together. And I think they found 10,000 of the 500,000 pilots had DUIs and other types of convictions. What's happening to that today?
They did say that may be considered in today's society as disinformation. It is an attempt to intimidate pilots because pilots felt they could get around the system. However, the courts are not accepting convictions based on the medical forms, at least, and based upon the federal court's holding in Florida.
Now that we're talking about violations, why don't you give me an idea about the sanctions the FAA will seek for different types of offenses?
All right. Yes, I have an extract from the FAA's internal document. It's called the FAA Compliance and Enforcement Program Handbook. It's routinely updated. It lists a number of the typical sanctions that one could obtain.
Why don't you give me some examples?
Sure. Right off the bat, for owners and operators other than required crew members, failure to comply with airworthiness directives on their airplanes, moderate to maximum civil penalty. We'll talk in a minute the difference between civil penalty and a suspension or revocation. Number 3, failure to make proper entries in an aircraft log, minimum to moderate civil penalty. Going over to the pilot category, student operations, carrying passengers, revocation. One can understand that.
Right.
Use of aircraft in business, i.e. a commercial operation, 90 to 120-day suspension. Operation for compensation or hire, revocation. Slipping over to flight instructors, false endorsement of student pilot certificate warrants revocation in their view. Instruction in aircraft for which he or she is not rated, 30 to 90-day suspension. Then operational violations for the typical pilot. I'll just cover a few of those. Failure to close a flight plan or file an arrival notice, an administrative action to a minimum civil penalty, operation without a valid pilot certificate, maximum civil penalty, and that's a situation where obviously they can't
How can they
suspend.
take away your license if you don't have one?
That's the lawn chair balloon pilot in San Francisco. He didn't have a license, so they went after the civil penalty. They have to go into federal court and convince the U.S. attorney to pursue this pilot for a maximum $1,000 per violation fine. The U.S. attorneys don't like to do that, so that really is a last alternative for the FAA. Let's talk about operation without valid medical certificate. Even 1 day out of medical, 30 to 180-day suspension. That could certainly end your career if you were suspended for 180 days. Operation for compensation or hire without a commercial license, 180-day suspension to revocation. And for example, some flying violations, failure to comply with airport traffic pattern, 30 to 60-day suspension, or operation in an ARSA without maintaining contact with ATC, again 30 to 60-day suspension. That gives you an example of some of the violations.
You mean, so just from flipping from the air traffic controller to ATIS, to listen to the ATIS as you're coming in and going back, could lead to a suspension?
Well, I think that at least is an explainable situation, but maybe that gets us into the next area as to how violations are located and who reports them.
Yeah, why don't you tell me how the FAA learns about a violation? They have their own investigative efforts?
You bet. There are three major groups that report violations: the air traffic controllers, the civil public, and then the investigators, the enforcement people with the FAA. And of course, there might be a fourth category. Occasionally, you report yourself.
You're going to talk about that.
Yes.
A lot of guys do that.
Okay. In the scenario where others report you, typically you receive a inquiry from the FAA, either a phone call or a radio call telling them to, when you get on the ground, to dial a certain number, or you receive a letter of inquiry. In any of those situations, the first bit of advice I can give everyone is don't respond to such a call or such a letter, because you'll fill in the blank that they need to fill in. For example, I'll show you a sample letter where a letter of investigation is written to an owner of an airplane. This office has received a complaint that on such and such a date, an aircraft identified as such, registered to you, was operated in a dangerous and hazardous manner. We also have been informed by the complaint that you had authorized the use of the aircraft. Operations of this type are contrary to the federal aviation regulations. We would like to know the name of the pilot and or personnel that you authorized to use the aircraft. Your assistance is appreciated.
That's just a fishing expedition?
It is indeed, and if you answer that letter, you're going to give them the information that they may need to prosecute you or whoever else was operating the aircraft.
That could just be like low flying, a neighbor complains, they don't know who's flying the plane, they don't even know if the plane was out that day.
That's true.
Okay, well, you mentioned something else about calling the tower. I had situations when I was younger, and you mentioned learning to fly in high school, Greg. That's when I learned to fly. I had to call the tower a couple times, and they chewed me out, and they knew I was a young guy, and I just says, I only got 52 hours. And you said, don't ever call them. Well, I called them, and nothing came of it.
When you were younger, the situation was a little bit different. Now, the controllers are pretty much required to report, and the other thing is that they are recording what is said. So the first question they'll ask is, were you the pilot of such and such an aircraft? When you answer yes, they fill in that little blank that the government needs to prove their case against you. So there isn't very much discretion on the controller's side, there is not much discretion on the FAA inspector's side, and there isn't much discretion on the FAA attorney's side as far as what sanction will be imposed. He can't negotiate very much at all. In fact, FAA has dictated that a 15% differential in the suggested suspension is all that leeway that he has.
I imagine an accident would be a way the FAA gets involved in something too.
Sure, and that's the either the NTSB or the FAA inspectors.
Okay, once the FAA decides they're going after a pilot's ticket, what weapons are at their disposal?
Well, if they're going after a pilot's ticket, it's usually a suspension or revocation. If the pilot doesn't have a ticket, we mentioned earlier, a civil penalty. Now, sometimes if the FAA believes that the violation is so minor that they will never be able to obtain a suspension, they will seek a suspension, and then at the last minute, if you agree to pay a civil penalty, they will switch it to a civil penalty. They will never pursue a civil penalty because they know the U.S. attorney won't follow up with it. So those are the tools at their discretion. One other tool, of course, is if they have a question about competency of a pilot, they can always examine you, conduct a flight test.
How does it get started? What is an administrative action? what happens when, what is the first thing a pilot's going to get when he's in trouble?
All right. The system works where those three groups report a violation. The inspector writes this letter or makes this phone call.
This is the 10-day letter?
Yes.
The letter of inquiry?
All right.
Okay.
And when you respond, if you're foolish enough to, or if you don't respond and the time elapses, then he turns it over to the FAA attorney. The FAA attorney then looks at it, determines whether there's any valid basis for it, and sends what is called a notice of proposed certificate action.
Okay,
That's
now
the first formal step.
Let me interrupt you just for one sec. That's the 10-day letter, but I understand the FAA has 180 days with which to begin the investigation, so they can wait till day 179, and even if you haven't answered that letter and you think everything's fine, they get in touch with you like 6 months after the fact.
That's
Is
right.
that correct?
They have 6 months, and sometimes they even can pursue them after 6 months. 6 months is where the rules say it becomes a stale complaint. But if there is good cause, as they say in the rules, they can either come after you after 6 months.
Okay, now you're going to show us.
The typical notice of proposed certificate action.
Go ahead and read it.
All right. It is entitled, actually, Notice of Proposed Certificate Action. It is usually sent by certified mail. Someone, yourself, your wife, signs for it. It says, take notice that upon consideration of the report of investigation, it appears that, 1, at all times herein pertinent, you were and presently are the holder of Airman Certificate number dash with commercial pilot privileges. Number 2, on or about such and such a date, you acted as pilot in command of civil aircraft, whatever number it is, a Piper model PA-30, in air taxi operations from one airport to another and return on the dates of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many they have. Number 3, you violated FAR 135.243 when you acted as pilot in command of an air taxi flight under instrument flight rules when you had less than 1,200 hours of flight time as a pilot. Number 4, you further violated FAR 135.297 when you acted as pilot in command of an air taxi flight under instrument flight rules when you had not passed an instrument proficiency check. This letter doesn't have it, but typically there's a number 5 now that says your actions were careless and reckless in violation of FAR 91.9. That's the catch-all FAR that they're putting in there now, because if they can't prove these specific violations, they can usually prove the general one, and that has been upheld by the National Transportation
So far, nothing sounds
Safety.
too bad, except they just told me something I did wrong.
Okay. Now they say, please take notice because of the foregoing violations you're alleged to have committed, and pursuant to the authority vested in the administrator under the FAA Act of 1958, we propose to suspend your airman certificate with all privileges and ratings for a period of 60 days. The letter goes on, unless we receive, and this is another invitation for you to help them prove their case, unless we receive in writing your choice of the alternatives provided and set forth in the enclosed information card, on or before such and such a date you will be deemed in default, and this office will issue an order suspending your airman certificate and all privileges and ratings proposed above. The next page, usually attached, is the FAA's information with respect to the notice of proposed certificate action. It gives you a date. On or prior to such and such a date, you may elect to initially proceed in any of the 4 ways set below.
So they're giving you 4 options.
That's right.
Okay.
And I'll abbreviate these. Number 1 is surrender your certificate, give up. All right. Number 2, indicate your desire to have an order issued so that you may appeal it. And that's the official legal process. Once the order is issued, that is basically the complaint, and then when you appeal it, the order is stayed and you start into the legal process. Number 3...
Until they issue an order, you can't fight with them.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Number 3, answer the charges in writing. That's the invitation for you to put the noose around your neck and pull it tight. All right? Don't do that. Number 4, request that you or your representative be accorded a conference with the assigned attorney at the regional office. Now, that's the best alternative if you do it right.
That's the informal conference.
That's right. The informal conference, if you send someone there as your representative and have them obtain the information that the FAA has, find out, do they really have a case against you? What are the loopholes? Then you're serving yourself well. If you go to the informal conference, you might as well write them the letter, because they're attorneys, they're clever, they know the system, and they will find out all the information they need, and they won't tell you one bit of the information that they have on you. Right. So the informal conference, in that case, really deserves you. Then it goes on and tells you where to communicate with. And it attaches a form that you fill out, and you choose one of those 4 items with a check mark and sign it and put your telephone number there.
Okay, are you guys convinced yet that you need an attorney? At what point you're an attorney, you make your living as an attorney? I'm a businessman. I'm involved with attorneys a lot. I look at them as a benefit to society, and the way the world goes around, a lot of people don't. At what point does a pilot need an attorney if he's told to call the tower, to show up for an informal conference that's at an FAA office, they just want to talk about it? He gets a 10-day letter in the mail. At what point does a guy need some professional legal help?
At the point when you're personally confronted by the FAA. If you receive a telephone call, simply indicate, "I'd like to obtain counsel," and hang up the phone. If you receive the call in the air, simply don't reply. If you receive a letter, you might consult an attorney and ask, "What do I do with this letter?" By the way, most attorneys are not familiar with the administrative law process, particularly the FAA's unique type of administrative law. Aviation attorneys usually are. The informal conference, you must have an attorney, otherwise you might as well send your ticket in.
I once attended an informal conference. I'm sorry I didn't show up with an attorney, but I was young then and nothing came of it. But
the temptation is there because we're pilots and because we're better than
I want to tell my side of the story. Don't you find everybody wants to tell their
Sure.
side of the story?
Yeah, we feel that we can explain it away, but what you have to realize is that this is an adversarial situation. These people are not there to help you. Once they ask you to call or write, they are trying to fill in the blanks, and they're looking for a suspension. You're only going to help them if you answer.
So to answer my question, the point at which you need an attorney is when you're told to contact the FAA.
That's right.
Or an air traffic controller, or answer any correspondence. That's when you need professional advice. And you're saying that it's best to have someone who's familiar in administrative law, and more probably aviation law, instead of just a general business attorney.
That's right. The only time you're required to respond is once the notice of proposed certificate action goes out. And in fact, you don't have to take any of those choices. If you do nothing, the order will be issued. You have 20 days after the order is issued to do something.
So
Appeal.
your license isn't gone the day you get it. You have 20 days to do something to try to save it.
That's right. Just because you don't respond to a notice of proposed certificate action, make one of those 4 choices, doesn't mean there's an automatic suspension. Okay. What it means is that the order is likely to follow, and that's what starts the legal proceeding.
Just in short terms, because at this point a pilot would have an attorney, if he does lose his license, if the FAA jerks the license after the informal conference or after some correspondence, what can be done? I mean, are you allowed to fight? Is administrative law offer a court with judges the same way a civil business or criminal trial is conducted? What are the guy's options?
You bet. Once the order is issued, that's the first opportunity you have to fight. That order is filed with the NTSB. The NTSB is the court system for the FAA. Other than the investigative process, which Greg will talk about, they are also the court system. And as soon as the FAA files their order with the NTSB, they step into court. You then step into court by filing an appeal. That stops the order. In other words, in 20 days, you're not suspended. That stops the order until they have a conviction. Right?
Good.
And that's how the legal process starts. After the order is issued, after you appeal it, you're assigned to a judge in the Denver area. It's Judge Garrity. You're assigned a date. You can do informal discovery, and then you come to the hearing. The hearing is the time, the only time, that you can present evidence on your behalf. That's when you call in witnesses, subpoena, documents, put on whatever evidence you have, call in experts, call in investigators from the NTSB if you need to. And at the end of that, the judge, it's only a judge, you're not entitled to a trial by jury, the judge, who is an employee of the NTSB, issues an order, usually follows what the FAA suspension recommendation is. Unfortunately, then you have to appeal to the full board. But that appeal is only on the record that you made during the hearing. So you can see how
It's
important
getting
the
pretty
hearing
drastic to go appeal to the full board, huh? That's going to be pretty costly for someone, too?
It is costly. However, there is a provision under the 5 United States Code, Section 504, whereas if you substantially prevail, you don't have to win on all counts. Substantially prevail is defined by the law. You are entitled to your attorney's fees and costs in return. And I've been successful. A number of pilots, the government has ordered that the government pay the money back, $6,000, $7,000 occasionally it takes to fight these things.
Pete, I've heard the word NTSB come up, so let's kick it over to Greg. Thanks for talking about enforcement and compliance. And Greg, the reason you're here is to talk about the NTSB's role and what type of agency is the NTSB?